Single mother agrees to give weakened millionaire a bath to pay bills. But what happened next? Emily Harper, a 32-year-old woman, woke to the blaring sound of her old alarm clock, its shrill tone mocking her exhaustion. Her days began before the sun rose and ended long after the stars had claimed the night sky. Hastily pinning her chestnut-brown hair into a loose bun, she glanced at her 5-year-old daughter, Lily, still sound asleep, and began preparing for another day filled with challenges. Since her ex-husband had disappeared, leaving behind only debts and broken promises, Emily had shouldered the household burden alone. Working as a waitress at a diner during the day and cleaning office buildings at night, she barely managed to scrape by. The constant worry about the future often kept her awake, but it was Lily who gave her the strength to carry on. The little girl, with her radiant smile, brought light even to Emily's darkest moments. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. That morning, however, something unexpected happened. As Emily sorted through the mail, her fingers paused on an envelope with a gilded border. Inside was a cold, impersonal eviction notice. The words felt as heavy as lead. She had 30 days to vacate the apartment unless she could pay the overdue rent. Her heart pounded. With no close relatives or friends able to help, the prospect of losing their home pushed her to the brink of despair. Still reeling, Emily went to her shift at the diner, but her mind was elsewhere. While serving a table, she overheard two women discussing an unusual job posting. Taking care of some rich old guy? Sounds like something out of a movie, one of them said with a laugh. But the pay is insane. You could pay off your debts and still have money left over. Their conversation planted a seed in Emily's mind. At the end of her shift, as Lily doodled on a sheet of paper at the counter, Emily pulled out her phone and searched the local job listings. There it was, caregiver needed for elderly individual. Beacon Hill Mansion. Generous compensation. Discretion and patience required. It seemed too good to be true, but Emily had no other options. With a mix of hope and trepidation, she decided to apply. Little did she know, that small decision would change her life forever. The next morning, Boston's sky was draped in gray clouds, mirroring Emily's mood as she prepared for the interview. She chose her best dress, a little worn but still professional enough. Lily, ever curious, clutched her mother's hand and asked, "Are you going to work in a castle, Mommy?" Emily smiled, masking her nerves. "Maybe, sweetie. It's just a big house, that's all." Deep down, she had no idea what to expect. When she arrived at Beacon Hill, Emily was awestruck by the grandeur of the mansion. The Whitmore estate was a gleaming monument of white marble, framed by towering iron gates and perfectly manicured gardens. She took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell, feeling small against such an imposing backdrop. A stern-faced housekeeper, impeccably dressed, answered the door and led Emily inside. The interior was even more opulent, with crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow over walls adorned with paintings that seemed to whisper tales of centuries past. Emily's journey had begun, though she had no way of knowing just how profoundly her world was about to change. In the living room, Emily was greeted by a tall, formal man who introduced himself as Charles, the Whitmore family attorney. He explained that Mr. Jonathan Whitmore, the owner of the mansion, was in poor health after a series of medical complications. The job requires patience and dedication. He doesn't trust many people, Charles warned, eyeing Emily with a skeptical gaze. Before she could respond, the door at the back of the room opened, and Jonathan appeared. He was in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse. Jonathan was a man in his 80s, with an aura that combined physical frailty and a commanding presence. His blue eyes, though tired, scrutinized Emily with such intensity that she had to look away for a moment. "So, you're the new candidate," he said, his voice raspy but firm. Emily responded with a timid nod and a hesitant smile. Jonathan asked her a few direct questions, wanting to know about her experience and why she was interested in the job. Emily chose to be honest. She shared her story about Lily, her financial struggles, and her determination to provide a better life for her daughter. Something in her sincerity seemed to resonate with Jonathan. He held her gaze for what felt like an eternity before finally murmuring, "Very well. Start tomorrow." Emily left the mansion with mixed emotions. The job seemed more challenging than she had anticipated, and Jonathan's demeanor was far from welcoming. Even so, this was her chance to turn her life around, and she knew she couldn't back down now. The next morning, a light drizzle made Boston's streets slick and slippery. Emily tied her hair into a practical ponytail and donned a simple coat, trying to convince herself that she was ready. Before leaving, she knelt in front of Lily, who was busy coloring with her crayons. "Be good for Mrs. Thompson, okay? Mommy will be back before dinner." Lily nodded, flashing the innocent smile of a child unaware of the weight her mother carried on her shoulders. When Emily arrived at the mansion, the housekeeper greeted her again, this time leading her directly to Jonathan's quarters. The room was spacious but austere, with a large window overlooking the gardens. Jonathan sat in his wheelchair, gazing outside, lost in thought. Emily approached cautiously, announcing her presence. He turned his head slowly, his melancholic blue eyes studying her in silence before finally saying, "I hope you're as good as they claim." The nurse in charge of Jonathan explained his routines and care requirements, handing Emily a detailed list. Among the tasks were helping Jonathan move, administering his medication, and, most delicately, assisting him with bathing. Jonathan listened silently until he abruptly interjected, "I don't need charity. If you're only here for the money, save us both the trouble." Those words hit Emily like a slap, but she stood her ground. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not here to judge your situation. I'm here to help you live with dignity. If that's not enough, tell me now." Jonathan seemed taken aback by her firmness but said nothing more, merely giving a slight nod before turning his gaze back to the window. The first day was challenging. Jonathan was clearly a proud man, and allowing someone else to help him seemed to wound that pride at every turn. During his bath, he kept his face turned to the side, avoiding Emily's gaze as she did her best to treat him with respect and care. Despite the uncomfortable silence, Emily noticed something different about him, a weariness that went beyond the physical, as though he carried an invisible burden on his soul. Later, while preparing his medication, Emily noticed a dusty picture frame in the corner of the room. It was an old photo of Jonathan with an elegant woman and a smiling boy who couldn't have been older than 10. The image felt out of place amidst the cold, impersonal atmosphere of the room. "Is this your family?" she ventured. Jonathan glanced at the photo for a few seconds before replying in a clipped tone. It was. The silence that followed was so heavy that Emily chose not to press further. At the end of the day, as Emily gathered her things, Jonathan finally spoke. "You're a stubborn girl. Maybe that's what I need." Despite the gruff tone, there was something akin to approval in his words. Emily left the mansion feeling that, as difficult as it was, she had taken the first step toward building something meaningful there. The second day began with a more tense atmosphere. When Emily arrived, the housekeeper informed her that Jonathan hadn't slept well and was in a worse mood than usual. That didn't faze Emily, who prepared to face him with the same patience and determination she had shown the day before. Entering the room, she found Jonathan sitting in his wheelchair near the fireplace, his expression one of deep exhaustion. "You're here too early," he grumbled without looking at her. Ignoring the remark, Emily set her bag aside and began organizing his medications on the small side table. "My daughter always says the day starts brighter when we smile," she said with a faint smile, hoping to lighten the mood. Jonathan let out a sigh that seemed to carry years of frustration. "Smiles don't solve anything," he muttered, though Emily detected a slight hesitation in his voice. As the day progressed, Emily began noticing small details that revealed more about the man Jonathan was. Although he maintained a rigid, reserved demeanor, She caught him glancing at the same photo in the frame more than once. His gaze wasn't merely nostalgic. It was laden with regret. During an afternoon tea break, she took another chance to start a conversation. The woman in the photo looks very elegant. She must have been wonderful company. Jonathan, visibly uncomfortable, replied evasively, "She was more than that." But some things slip away, no matter how hard you try to hold on to them. A silence followed, which Emily respected, though she felt that his comment was a small crack in the emotional wall he had built around himself. As she helped him adjust his blanket, he asked unexpectedly, "Are you afraid of failing?" The question caught her off guard. "I think we all are, in some way, but fear can't stop us from trying," she replied. Jonathan didn't respond, but his gaze grew distant and reflective, as if her words had stirred something deep within him. At the end of the day, as Emily was preparing to leave, Jonathan called her back. "Girl, Emily, right?" She nodded. "I'm not an easy man to deal with, and I don't expect you to understand my reasons. But thank you for not running away." He held her gaze for a moment before looking away. Emily felt that, even with so few words, he was acknowledging her dedication, and it fueled her determination even more. When she arrived home, Emily found Lily playing with a piece of paper, drawing what looked like a large house with glowing windows. "Look, Mommy, it's the castle where you work." Emily smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. As hard as the job was, she was beginning to realize that it held the potential to transform not only Jonathan but also herself. By the start of the following week, a routine began to take shape. Emily had memorized Jonathan's preferences and the timing of his medications. Still, their interactions were often punctuated by uncomfortable silences and curt responses. She understood that earning the trust of someone like him would take time, but she couldn't deny that his resistance often left her feeling drained. That morning, as she opened the curtains in Jonathan's room, she was met with a grumble. "You enjoy being a nuisance, don't you?" She smiled faintly, brushing off the remark. "Sunlight is good for the mood, Mr. Whitmore. Maybe that's just what we need around here." He shook his head with an irritated sigh but didn't ask her to close the curtains again. To Emily, that felt like a small victory. After helping him with his bath and breakfast, she proposed something unexpected: a walk through the gardens. Jonathan hesitated, skeptical, but eventually relented, perhaps unwilling to prolong the argument. Carefully, Emily pushed his wheelchair outside the mansion, where they were greeted by the crisp air and the scent of freshly watered flowers. This time, the silence between them felt less heavy. As they strolled, Emily noticed Jonathan's gaze fixated on an old fountain in the center of the garden. She followed him to it, observing as he lightly touched the edge of the stone, as though revisiting a memory. "My wife loved this spot," he said, breaking the silence. "She used to say the sound of the water was like music for the soul." His voice carried a melancholy tone Emily hadn't heard before. "This is where I proposed to her." Emily sat on a nearby bench, respecting the moment. "That must have been beautiful. Not everyone has a story like that to tell." Jonathan chuckled dryly, a short, raspy sound. "Beautiful stories come with a price, girl. The question is it worth paying?" Before Emily could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car arriving at the mansion gates. A man in a perfectly tailored suit with a cold expression stepped out. Ethan Whitmore, Jonathan's son. He walked toward the garden, seeming surprised to see his father outside. "I didn't expect you to be enjoying the sunshine," Ethan said, his voice a mixture of irony and concern. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his displeasure clear. "I'm still breathing, Ethan. No need to act so surprised." Emily watched the interaction carefully, quickly sensing the tension between the two. Ethan shot her a scrutinizing look, clearly trying to figure out who the young woman by his father's side was. Before he could ask any questions, Jonathan waved his hand dismissively, signaling the end of the outing. That's enough for today. Take me back, Emily. Back in his room, Jonathan remained silent, his mood visibly affected by his son's arrival. Emily didn't press him but felt there was far more to their relationship than what she had witnessed. The next day, Ethan's presence at the mansion completely changed the atmosphere. He had decided to stay for a few days, claiming he needed to address pending matters related to the family business. Emily noticed that Jonathan's son stirred a restlessness in him she didn't yet understand. While preparing the afternoon tea, she overheard Ethan's voice in the hallway, firm and critical. "I don't see why you insist on hiring strangers to take care of you, father. Don't you think the housekeeper and the nurses are enough?" Jonathan replied with equal sharpness, "Because enough weren't here while I was wasting away." Emily entered the room with the tea tray just as a cutting silence settled over the space. Ethan looked at her as though she were an intruder. Maintaining her professional composure, she placed the tray on the table and began pouring. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said, stepping closer. "Ethan Whitmore." Emily extended her hand, feeling the weight of his analytical gaze. "Emily Harper." The conversation between father and son resumed as soon as she stepped away, but now in hushed tones, barely above a whisper. Emily tried to focus on tidying up Jonathan's room, but the fragmented words she overheard revealed long-standing grievances. Ethan complained about the company's state and accused his father of stubbornly shutting him out of major decisions. Jonathan, in turn, accused Ethan of prioritizing numbers and profits while neglecting the family. The tension between them felt like a taut rope, ready to snap. Later, as Emily helped Jonathan prepare for bed, she sensed he was especially contemplative. "My son thinks I'm weak. He always has," Jonathan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Emily glanced at him, hesitating before responding. "Maybe he just doesn't know how to handle the changes. Sometimes people use work as an escape." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "Escape? He wasn't even here when I needed him. He didn't even come to bury his mother." Those words, heavy with pain, hung in the air, and Emily realized the wound was far deeper than she had imagined. The following day, Ethan approached her in the hallway. "You seem to get along with my father. What's your secret?" His tone was half mocking, but Emily detected genuine curiosity behind the question. "There's no secret, Mr. Whitmore. I just listen." Ethan fell silent for a moment, as if considering her answer. "Well, good luck with that," he said before walking away. Despite his cold demeanor, Emily sensed that Ethan was beginning to watch her more closely, as if trying to understand why Jonathan had allowed her into his life. Time moved slowly in the mansion, but the invisible threads between the three of them were starting to intertwine in ways no one could have anticipated. Over the following days, Ethan began spending more time at the mansion, though much of it was consumed by long phone meetings or hours locked in his old office. He wasn't particularly sociable, but Emily noticed that he often appeared discreetly during her moments with Jonathan. Whether it was during physical therapy sessions or walks in the garden, Ethan would be there watching from a distance, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. One afternoon, as Emily wheeled Jonathan toward the library, Ethan appeared in the hallway with a folder in hand. "We need to talk about the board meeting, Dad. Decisions have to be made." Jonathan sighed, his exhaustion apparent. "These meetings never stop, do they? Always another contract, another number." He glanced at Emily and said, almost as though excusing himself, "I used to think that was everything, until I realized the clock doesn't stop, no matter how hard you try to hold it back." Sensing the private nature of the conversation, Emily began to step away, but Jonathan held her hand. "Stay." Ethan frowned, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. "This is between us, Dad." Jonathan shook his head, resolute. "Maybe it's time for more us in my decisions, Ethan. Maybe you should learn to listen more too." Emily felt out of place, but at the same time, the moment revealed a vulnerability shared by both father and son. Jonathan was withdrawing from the decisions that had once defined his life. While Ethan struggled to take control of responsibilities, he wasn't entirely sure how to manage. She could see the emotional chasm between them, a gap created by years of misplaced priorities. That evening, as Emily served Jonathan his nighttime tea, he opened up about what had been weighing on his mind. "My son thinks I shut him out of my life. Maybe he's right. When my wife died, I buried myself in work. I thought I was protecting him, making sure he'd never have to worry about anything. But really, I was just pushing him away." He took a sip of tea and continued, his voice quieter. "Now I see that work took everything. Even the things I loved most." Emily felt a lump in her throat but maintained a practical tone. "It's never too late to try and rebuild, Mr. Whitmore. Your son is here now, and that's already a start." Jonathan gave her a faint, bittersweet smile. "Rebuild, maybe, but what if he doesn't want to?" In the days that followed, Emily noticed that Ethan began asking casual questions about Jonathan, how he spent his days, how he was responding to treatment. There was something in his expression that blended concern with guilt. Emily answered patiently, recognizing that Ethan was, in his own way, trying to reconnect with his father, though he still hesitated to take the first step. The mansion's silence one morning was broken by an unexpected conversation in the kitchen. Ethan stood there, holding a cup of coffee, while Emily prepared Jonathan's breakfast. It was rare to see him outside his office or away from his endless calls. He appeared relaxed, but there was a restlessness in his eyes that he couldn't hide. "Do you do this every day?" Ethan asked, watching as Emily carefully arranged the breakfast tray. "Apparently, yes, but it's more than just making breakfast. Taking care of someone means more than completing tasks. It means paying attention." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That sounds like a philosophy for such a simple job." Emily gave a soft smile. "Sometimes the simplest things are the most complicated." Ethan remained silent, as if contemplating her response. When Emily finished preparing the tray, he surprised her by following her to Jonathan's room, something he had never done before. Jonathan was lying in bed, his eyes widening at the sight of his son. "What are you doing here so early?" Ethan shrugged. "I decided I want to see how you spend your days." "That's not so strange, is it?" Emily observed the interaction with curiosity. It was clear that both men were testing each other's boundaries, but something felt different this time. Ethan seemed less defensive, more willing to observe than criticize. During breakfast, he asked Jonathan simple questions, as if trying to familiarize himself with this new routine. Jonathan, though still cautious, answered with more patience than usual. Later, while Jonathan rested, Ethan found Emily in the living room. "How do you manage him? He can be difficult." Emily chuckled softly. "I've dealt with harder situations. The secret is remembering that behind all the toughness is a person trying to find balance." He nodded slowly, as if processing her words. "I don't think I've ever seen him so calm. Maybe you're onto something about paying attention." The following days followed a similar rhythm, with Ethan increasingly joining in Jonathan's activities. He started accompanying them on walks in the garden, sitting in the library while Jonathan read aloud to Emily, and even participating in quiet moments, like watching the rain through the window. Gradually, these shared moments began to feel natural rather than forced. One afternoon, during a walk, Jonathan, in a rare moment of vulnerability, placed his hand over Ethan's. "You're here now. That's more than I could ask for." Ethan, visibly moved, squeezed his father's hand in response. Emily, witnessing the moment, felt that the barrier between the two was beginning to dissolve, one step at a time. The days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the Whitmore mansion began to shift. The somber silence that once filled its halls was replaced by occasional conversations and even subdued laughter. Emily noticed this with satisfaction, though tempered with caution. She knew these steps forward were fragile, like delicate crystals that could shatter with the slightest misstep. One evening, While helping Jonathan organize an old drawer of documents, Emily found a photo album. The pages were yellowed with age, but the images captured vivid memories. A young Jonathan, standing beside a smiling woman and a lively little boy. "That was Margaret, my wife," Jonathan said, his fingers brushing the edge of the photo with almost imperceptible tenderness. "And that's Ethan, of course," before he became far too serious for his own good. Emily smiled at the happiness radiating from the faces in the photos. "It looks like you were very close," Jonathan sighed, his expression clouded with melancholy. "We were, until I decided that work was more important. There was always a contract, always a meeting. I thought I was doing the best for them, but I missed the moments that truly mattered." He turned another page and stopped at a picture of Ethan holding a medal. "He won this at school. I promised I'd be there to see him, but, well, you already know how that story ends." Later, when Ethan came to dinner, Emily carefully left the album on the living room table. He noticed it as he walked in and, after a brief hesitation, began flipping through the pages. His expression shifted as the memories resurfaced, his eyes lingering on a photo of him and his mother playing by the garden fountain. "I remember this day," he said, almost in a whisper. "It was one of the last times we were all together." Jonathan, seated in his nearby chair, watched silently, as though unsure of how to respond. "You know it was never about the money, Dad," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. "I just wanted you to be there." Jonathan swallowed hard, the words seeming heavier than he could bear. "I know that now, son, but back then I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was building something for you." Ethan closed the album but left it on the table, a symbol of the past they were both beginning to confront. Emily watched from a distance, aware that this dialogue was an important step, but that much remained unresolved. When Ethan retreated to his office, Jonathan turned to Emily and said quietly, "I see what you're trying to do, girl, and I'm grateful for it." Before heading home that night, Emily found Ethan in the hallway, his expression still pensive. "I think sometimes we have to face the past to move forward," she said, trying not to sound intrusive. Ethan nodded, though his eyes still carried a heaviness. "You seem to have a talent for that, Emily, getting people to face things they'd rather forget." She smiled, slightly awkward. "Maybe it's because I've had to face a lot of things myself." A new dynamic was beginning to take shape at the Whitmore mansion. Jonathan, once isolated in his solitude, was now seen sharing lighter moments, conversing with Emily or exchanging careful words with Ethan. The atmosphere, while still tinged with a history of hurt, was starting to soften. Emily felt that her presence was, in some way, helping to mend the wounds of this fractured family. On a rainy morning, Jonathan decided to come down to the living room, something he rarely did without Emily's encouragement. He settled into an armchair near the window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. Emily, holding a book, sat on the nearby sofa, ready to read a chapter from one of her favorite novels. Jonathan, however, seemed lost in thought. "Do you believe in new beginnings, Emily?" he asked, breaking the silence. She looked up from the book, surprised by the question. "I believe it's never too late to try, Mr. Whitmore. What matters is what we do from now on." Jonathan pondered for a moment before murmuring, "Perhaps you're right, but starting over takes courage. And time. And time is what I don't have." Emily felt the weight of his words but responded firmly, "As long as there's another day, there's time to change something." Later that same day, Ethan walked into the living room with a folder full of documents. "Dad, I need you to sign a few things. They're decisions about the company." Jonathan looked at him with evident exhaustion, but there was something different in his gaze. "Why don't you tell me exactly what's going on, Ethan? Not as a businessman, but as my son." Ethan hesitated but eventually sat down. "The company is stable, but it demands so much from me. Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it." Jonathan studied him closely, as if seeing something new in his son. Maybe you're finally starting to understand what it took me a lifetime to realize. Emily remained silent, taking in the exchange between the two. In a rare gesture, Jonathan reached out to Ethan. I trusted you to take over the business because I knew you were capable. But I never wanted it to cost you your life. Maybe it's time we find some balance. Ethan took his father's hand, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. We're still figuring that out, aren't we? Jonathan smiled, a fragile yet genuine smile. We are. And as long as we're alive, there's hope. That night, after bidding Jonathan goodnight, Emily found Ethan on the mansion's balcony, staring at the clear sky that had emerged after the rain. My father has changed a lot since you arrived, he said, his eyes fixed on the stars. Emily crossed her arms, shielding herself from the cold wind. I think he just needed someone to listen. We all do. Ethan turned to her, his gaze carrying a gratitude he didn't yet know how to articulate. Thank you for that, Emily, for everything. Autumn was settling over Boston, painting the Whitmore Mansion's gardens with shades of orange and gold. The scene seemed to mirror the transformation taking place inside the house. Jonathan spent more time with Ethan, discussing not just business but also the past, as if they were trying to recover lost conversations from over the years. Emily continued to play a pivotal role, often mediating tense moments with her calm and steady presence. One late afternoon, as Emily helped Jonathan adjust his blanket by the fireplace, he looked at her with a reflective expression. You know, Emily, I never thought it was possible to feel this kind of peace again. For so long, this mansion was just empty walls. Now it feels alive. Emily smiled, knowing this was one of the most open declarations Jonathan had ever made. Maybe you found reasons to look beyond the walls. As Jonathan dozed off, Ethan appeared at the doorway. He seems calmer lately. That's because of you, he said, walking toward the couch where Emily was seated. She shook her head. I think he just needed a little push to see what was already around him. Ethan sat down beside her, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. I've never seen him talk so openly. It's like he trusts you in a way he's never trusted anyone. He paused, hesitating before continuing. And so do I. Emily turned to him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. I just did what felt right. And I think you and your father are discovering something that's always been here, even if it was buried. Ethan looked at her for a moment, as if searching for something in her eyes. You have this way of simplifying things, but they're not that simple. He smiled faintly. Even so, thank you. That night, Emily felt that something was shifting, not just between Jonathan and Ethan, but also between her and Ethan. There was a new layer of understanding, something forming slowly, like the leaves falling from the branches, transforming the landscape over time. The next day, while organizing Jonathan's medication, he remarked casually, "My son's been talking a lot about you lately. I've never seen Ethan so interested in someone who wasn't himself or the business." Emily, catching the suggestive tone in his voice, tried to deflect. "I think it's because he's changing. You both are." Jonathan chuckled softly. "Maybe so, but I can tell when someone cares more than they're willing to admit." Later, Ethan found Emily in the garden, where she was admiring the trees and flowers, their vibrant colors starting to fade. "My father said something funny today," he began, his hands in his pockets. "He said I've been talking about you a lot. I'm not sure if he's right or wrong." Emily's heart quickened, but she kept her composure. "Maybe it's because you have more to care about now." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Maybe, or maybe it's because, for the first time, I feel like someone actually understands what all of this means." Emily felt the intensity of the moment, but before she could respond, Jonathan appeared on the veranda, calling them inside because of the chilly wind. The connection, though interrupted, lingered in the air. With each passing day, the bonds between the three grew deeper and more intertwined. As the days went by, The Whitmore mansion seemed increasingly alive with an energy that had been absent for years. Jonathan continued to show signs of cautious optimism, while Ethan spent more time at home than at the office, something even the mansion staff had noticed. Emily, meanwhile, balanced her work with her constant care for her daughter Lily, who often asked when she could visit the castle. One quiet afternoon, Jonathan made an unexpected suggestion. "Emily, why don't you bring Lily here for a day? It must be exhausting for her to always wait for you to come home." Emily hesitated, surprised by the idea. "I don't know. I wouldn't want to impose." Jonathan let out a short laugh. "This house used to be full of life. Maybe it's time to fill it again." With Jonathan's approval, Emily decided to bring Lily over for the weekend. When she arrived with her daughter, Lily's eyes lit up at the sight of the grand mansion. "It really is a castle, Mommy." Jonathan, seated in his wheelchair in the entry hall, gave the little girl a warm smile. "You must be Lily. Welcome to my castle." Lily, enchanted, ran up to shake his hand, her innocent curiosity breaking through any sense of formality. The day was filled with unexpected moments. Lily explored the garden, running between the trees and flowers with a joy that seemed to uplift everyone around her. Jonathan watched from a distance, his expression shifting between nostalgia and contentment. Emily, meanwhile, was surprised to see Ethan joining Lily, helping her reach an apple from one of the taller trees. "He doesn't look anything like the serious businessman I first met," Emily commented with a laugh to Jonathan, who shook his head with a smile. "Sometimes, a child reminds us of what truly matters." Later, inside the mansion, Lily managed to convince Ethan and Jonathan to join her in a board game she had brought along. Laughter echoed through the walls as everyone got caught up in the game, something Emily had never imagined witnessing. Little Lily snuggled up next to Jonathan, calling him Grandpa without a second thought. Jonathan was silent for a moment, visibly moved, but eventually stroked the girl's hair with an expression Emily had never seen before, a mix of joy and fulfillment. As the day came to an end, Emily and Lily said their goodbyes, but not before Jonathan promised the little girl that she could come back anytime she wanted. At the gate, Ethan walked Emily out. "You've brought something to this house that no amount of money could ever buy," he said, his voice low and sincere. Emily looked at him, feeling the connection between them deepen once again. "I just did what anyone would do." Ethan shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, Emily, you did much more." Lily's visit left a positive impact on the mansion, and Emily began noticing even deeper changes in Jonathan and Ethan. Jonathan seemed lighter, less weighed down by his memories, and even on his more difficult days, there was a renewed sense of purpose in him. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to draw closer to Emily. He now made a point of joining in casual conversations and often found small ways to help her with tasks, something she found both charming and unexpected. One evening, as Emily was organizing Jonathan's medication, Ethan appeared in the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of wine. "I thought you might like a break after all the work you've been doing," he said, placing one of the glasses in front of her. Emily hesitated but accepted. "Thank you. I think a break would be nice." They sat down at the kitchen table, the silence filled by the soft sound of rain outside. "You know, I never thought coming back here would bring me anything but heaviness and bad memories," Ethan said, swirling the wine in his glass. "But lately, it feels like things are falling into place in ways I never expected." Emily looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. "Maybe it's because you finally made space for what really matters." Ethan chuckled softly. "You have this way of simplifying things that just disarms people." He paused, as though searching for the right words. "I've never said this, but watching the way you care for my father, the way you understand him, it's made me see things in him that I'd forgotten." He looked directly at her, his voice dropping. "And it's also made me see things about you." Emily's heart raced, but she tried to stay composed. I only did what I thought was right. Your father deserved someone who cared. Ethan shook his head, as if disagreeing. You did much more than that. You brought life to this house. To him. To me. The moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, a tired smile on his face. I hope you're not conspiring against me in here. Emily laughed, while Ethan quickly stood to help his father. Jonathan's light-hearted comment eased the tension of the moment, but it couldn't erase the connection that had just been formed between Emily and Ethan. That night, as she left the mansion, Emily felt a mix of emotions. Something was changing not just between Jonathan and Ethan, but between her and Ethan as well. And no matter how much she tried to keep her feet on the ground, she knew her feelings were beginning to grow stronger. Winter arrived in Boston with biting winds and soft snowflakes, blanketing the Whitmore Mansion's gardens in white. The scene was almost magical, but the emotional transformations happening inside the house were even more profound. Jonathan, more energized than ever, insisted on planning a small Christmas celebration to bring the family together, something he hadn't done since his wife's passing. It's time to bring the Christmas spirit back to this house, he declared, a sparkle in his eyes that Emily had never seen before. Emily threw herself into the preparations, helping to decorate the mansion. Christmas trees were set up, wreaths were hung, and twinkling lights adorned the hallways. Ethan, who once seemed uninterested in such traditions, surprised her by joining one afternoon to hang ornaments. I never thought I'd find myself doing this again, he remarked, holding a golden star. But somehow it feels right. Emily smiled. Sometimes we need these moments to remind us of what really matters. On Christmas Eve, Lily was invited to spend the night at the mansion. She arrived brimming with excitement, carrying a small gift she had wrapped herself for Jonathan. When she handed him the package, Jonathan opened it carefully, revealing a childlike drawing of him, Emily, Ethan, and Lily all together. His eyes filled with tears, and he hugged Lily tenderly. You have a gift, my dear. I'll treasure this forever. During dinner, Jonathan raised a toast. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. For the past several years, this house has been far too quiet. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, I feel like it's full of life again. And that, I must say, is thanks to all of you. He looked at Ethan, Emily, and Lily in turn, his gaze full of gratitude. I thought I had lost all my chances, but you've shown me that it's never too late to start over. After dinner, while Lily played near the fireplace and Jonathan rested in his armchair, Ethan and Emily stepped out into the garden, where snow fell gently around them. The silence between them was comfortable, as though no words were needed to convey what they felt. Ethan finally broke the silence. You've changed everything, you know? Not just for my father, but for me too. Emily looked at him, snowflakes softly landing on her hair. I think I just helped you see what was always here. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. No, you brought something here that was never here before. Before Emily could respond, he leaned in and kissed her, a gesture full of sincerity and emotion. When they returned inside, Jonathan glanced at them and smiled, as if he knew exactly what had happened. Lily ran up to Emily, grabbing her hand and showing her another drawing she had made. In that moment, Emily realized her life was changing in ways she could never have imagined, and that the Whitmore Mansion was no longer just a workplace. It was becoming a home. The days after Christmas flew by, but the warmth of the festivities seemed to linger in the mansion. Jonathan appeared more energized, his health seeming to improve with the renewed spirit that now filled the house. Emily, growing more confident in her place there, increasingly felt like part of this unlikely family. Ethan, for his part, was more present than ever, as if he had rediscovered a purpose greater than the business that had once consumed him. On a cold January afternoon, Jonathan called Emily and Ethan for a conversation in his library. Sitting in his favorite armchair, his expression was serious, but his eyes carried a rare gentleness. "I wanted to say something to the two of you. Since Margaret passed, I thought my life was ending too. I believed there was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to hope for. But you proved me wrong." Jonathan looked directly at Ethan. "Son, I see a change in you that I never thought possible. You're becoming the man your mother always knew you could be." Ethan lowered his head for a moment, clearly moved by his father's words. "I owe much of that to her," he said, gesturing toward Emily. "She brought us back together." Jonathan then turned his gaze to Emily. "And you, my dear, brought life to this house. You didn't just care for me with more patience than I deserved. You brought hope, joy, and Lily, of course. I couldn't ask for more than that." He paused, the emotion evident in his voice. "I want you both to know that no matter what happens from here on, you are my family now, and I am a happier man because of it." Emotion filled the room. Ethan placed a hand on his father's shoulder, and Emily, feeling tears well up in her eyes, could only nod, unable to find words in that moment. It was a turning point not just for Jonathan but for all of them. That night, as Emily tucked Lily into bed, the little girl asked, "Mommy, are we going to live here forever?" The question caught Emily off guard, but she smiled and replied, "I don't know, my love, but I think we're exactly where we're meant to be right now." Later, Ethan found Emily in the kitchen as she washed the last dishes of the day. "My father's right, you know. You've brought something unique to this house." He stepped closer, gently taking her hand to stop her work. "And to me, too." Emily felt the warmth in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes. "I never imagined someone could come into my life like this, but now that you're here, I can't picture it without you." Emily smiled, and in that moment, she knew that everything she had endured, all the struggles and sacrifices, had led her to this place, to this unexpected but deeply meaningful connection. The future was still uncertain, but she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Spring arrived, bringing blooms to the Whitmore Mansion's gardens and an air of renewal that seemed to mirror the family's transformation. Jonathan, though still physically limited, was more active and engaged, his presence radiating a quiet joy. Emily, now far more than just a caregiver, felt like an integral part of the household in ways she had never imagined. Ethan, for his part, was almost unrecognizable, more relaxed, more present, more human. On a sunny Sunday morning, Jonathan made an announcement over breakfast. "I've got something special planned for today. I want everyone in the garden at 4 o'clock. No excuses." Emily and Ethan exchanged curious glances, but Jonathan refused to share any details. "Just trust me. For once in your lives," he said with a mischievous smile. When the clock struck 4, everyone gathered in the garden, where a small altar had been set up beneath a blossoming cherry tree. Rows of chairs were neatly arranged, and a trail of rose petals led to the altar. Emily, confused, looked at Jonathan, who sat in his wheelchair, visibly emotional. "What is this?" she asked hesitantly. Ethan, standing beside her, took her hand. "My dad had an idea, but I admit I agreed with him." Before Emily could process what was happening, Ethan knelt before her, holding a small velvet box in his hands. "Emily, from the moment you walked into this house, you changed everything. You didn't just bring my father back to me. You brought a light into my life that I didn't even realize I needed. You've taught me to cherish what really matters, and I don't want to spend another day without you by my side." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegantly crafted ring. "Will you marry me?" Emily brought her hand to her mouth, her heart racing. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Ethan, then at Jonathan and Lily, who were beaming with joy. "Yes, yes, I will," she answered, her voice trembling with emotion. The small altar turned out to be the perfect setting for an impromptu ceremony, attended by the mansion's few staff members and the housekeeper, who smiled with a glimmer of pride in her eyes. Jonathan insisted on being the best man and held Lily in his lap during the ceremony, despite his frail health. He wept as he watched Emily and Ethan exchange vows, declaring it the happiest day of his life. Months later, the Whitmore mansion was more alive than ever. Emily and Ethan had settled into a life filled with love and partnership, while Lily filled the halls with her infectious laughter. Jonathan, now officially called Grandpa, seemed to have found peace, his health remaining stable thanks to the love and joy that now filled his days. On a peaceful afternoon, as Emily read on the veranda and Ethan played with Lily in the garden, Jonathan watched from his wheelchair, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. "I never imagined I'd spend my final days like this," he murmured to himself, "but it's better than anything I could have ever dreamed." That evening, Emily, Ethan, and Lily gathered around Jonathan by the fireplace, listening to his old stories as the fire's warmth filled the room. The family that had once seemed broken was now whole, bound by love and renewal. And for the first time in many years, everyone went to bed knowing they were living the best chapter of their lives. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.